The postcard was sitting in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, and it made me stop breathing. I know that sounds dramatic, but I mean it literally. My lungs just ceased their function. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it on the driveway. The front showed a lighthouse on a rocky coast somewhere I didn't recognize, but it was the postmark that stopped my heart. 2 years after my father's funeral, his handwriting was asking me how I'd been. I sat down on the curb, right there in my front yard, and I read the message over and over again. "Hey, sweetheart, hope you're doing well. Thinking of you, love, Dad." That was it. 12 words. 12 words that reordered everything I knew about death, grief, and whether I was losing my mind. My father had died 2 years ago. I was there. I watched them lower his casket into the ground. I'd scattered his ashes over the ocean because that's what he wanted. I'd spent the last 24 months learning how to breathe without him, how to make decisions he would have made for me, how to exist in a world that no longer contained his physical presence. And now, apparently, he was in a lighthouse somewhere, thinking of me. I called my mom. She didn't answer. I called my sister, same. I looked at the postmark more carefully. The date was smudged, but it looked like it was from last month, maybe 2 weeks ago. The stamp was faded. The edges of the postcard were worn, like it had traveled a long distance. Or a long time. I went inside and I laid the postcard on my kitchen table. I made a cup of tea that I didn't drink. I sat there staring at it for 3 hours. My rational mind, the part of me that pays taxes and schedules doctor's appointments, kept trying to find logical explanations. Someone was playing a cruel joke. Someone had found the postcard he'd written before he died and mailed it as some kind of sick prank. The Postal Service had lost it for 2 years, and it was finally arriving. That last one actually made the most sense, except that the postmark looked recent. Fresh. Like it had just been sent. I texted my friend Carla. "Can I come over? I think I'm having a breakdown." She didn't ask questions. She just said yes. When I showed her the postcard, she went very still. "Okay," she said slowly. "Either your dad is alive or someone is messing with you in the most fucked up way possible." "What if he's alive?" I whispered. The words felt impossible in my mouth, like I was speaking a language I didn't understand. "Then we need to figure out why he's been pretending to be dead for 2 years, Carla said. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up and checking my phone, thinking maybe he'd call, maybe he'd explain, maybe this was all some bizarre misunderstanding. But nothing came. Just silence and the postcard sitting on my nightstand and the sound of my own heartbeat filling my chest like a fist. The next morning I called my mom again. This time she answered. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. And then I described the postcard. I watched the silence stretch across the phone line like a rubber band pulled too tight. "That's not possible," she finally said. "I know," I replied, "but it happened." She came over that afternoon. She was pale and she moved like someone had removed all her joints. She picked up the postcard like it was a bomb that might explode. She read it 3 times, and then she said something that made everything worse. "This is his handwriting, I'm sure of it, but that doesn't mean anything. Anyone could have copied it. Anyone could have—" "Mom," I interrupted. "Why would anyone do this? What would they have to gain?" She sat down at my kitchen table and put her head in her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." I decided to investigate. I'm not a detective, but I was a daughter who just had her grief upended, and I had nothing to lose. I pulled out my laptop and I started searching. I looked at the postmark again. It looked like it might be from a town in Maine, though the ink was too faded to be sure. The lighthouse on the front was generic, the kind you'd find in tourist shops everywhere. I called the post office. The woman who answered was patient but unhelpful. They couldn't trace postcards. They didn't have that kind of detailed record. I called my father's bank. They said they couldn't discuss his account with me. It took me 3 phone calls and some creative lying to get an answer. There had been no transactions in 2 years. The account was frozen after death. I called his doctor's office. He was still listed as deceased. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My father was dead, except for the postcard that said he wasn't. I went through his emails. He didn't have a computer, so I had his old laptop. My mom had given it to me after he died, and I'd never really looked through it thoroughly. But now I searched for Maine, lighthouse, trip, anything that might give me a clue. Nothing. Just recipes he'd never made and articles about fishing he'd never sent. Then I found something. A folder labeled "For Later." Inside were Word documents dated just before he died. They had cryptic titles. "When the Time Comes," "If You're Reading This," "The Real Story." My hands were shaking again as I opened them. The first one was blank. The second one was mostly blank too, except for a single sentence. "I'm sorry, but you were never supposed to see this." The third document contained a single address in Portland, Maine, latitude and longitude coordinates, and a date, 2 weeks from now. I sat back in my chair. 2 weeks from now. That was written before his death. Unless he'd accessed his computer from beyond the grave, which was impossible. Someone else had put this file here. Someone had been in his computer after he died. I looked back at the folder creation date. It was created the day before his funeral. I picked up the postcard again and I studied his handwriting one more time. The way he looped his D's, the slight slant to his letters. It looked exactly like him. It looked so much like him that I could almost hear his voice saying the words, "Hey, sweetheart, hope you're doing well." And that's when I realized, maybe he wanted me to find him. Maybe he'd left a trail. The postcard was the first breadcrumb. The coordinates and the date were the second. And there was one thing that I suddenly understood. The date on the coordinates was 2 weeks away. He was telling me when to come. He was telling me where to go. The question was, should I go? I called Carla. "I think my dad is alive," I said, "and I think he wants me to meet him." "Oh my God," she said, "are you going to go?" "I don't know," I replied. "What if he's not who I think he is? What if he's been living a double life? What if he's done something terrible and that's why he faked his death?" "Then you deserve to know," Carla said, "and he deserves to explain." She was right, and I was terrified. For the next 2 weeks I prepared. I told my mom I was going to Maine for a work conference, which was a lie, and I could see her wondering if I was lying, but she didn't push. I couldn't tell her the truth because she'd never let me go. I booked a hotel. I rented a car. I printed out the coordinates and I found the location on Google Maps. It was a lighthouse, naturally. The same lighthouse, probably, from the postcard. It was on a private property about 30 minutes outside of Portland. There was a small house next to it, and according to the satellite image, someone had been maintaining the property. There was a car in the driveway. The night before I left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd say to him. Why did you leave me? Why did you fake your death? Who are you? Nothing felt adequate. Nothing felt big enough to contain the questions that had been building up inside me for 2 years. And then my phone rang at 2 a.m. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello," I answered. There was breathing on the other end, just breathing, and then a voice I'd know anywhere at all, even after 2 years of thinking I'd never hear it again. "Sweetheart," my father said, "I'm so glad you're coming," and then the line went dead. I drove to Maine in a fog of emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy, because joy requires certainty, and I had none of that. It wasn't anger, because anger requires understanding, and I understood nothing. It was something closer to vertigo, like the world had tilted on its axis and I was just trying to keep my footing. I found the lighthouse on a gray morning when the ocean was the same color as the sky. The house next to it was small and weathered, with white paint peeling off the sides like skin after a sunburn. There was a car in the driveway, just like the satellite image said there would be. I sat in my rental car for 20 minutes. I couldn't make myself get out. I kept thinking about turning around, driving back to the city and pretending none of this had happened. I could tell myself I'd imagined it. I could tell myself the postcard was fake. I could construct a reality where my father was still dead and the world still made sense, but I didn't. I got out of the car. The door to the house opened before I reached it, and there was my father. Older, thinner, his hair completely gray now, but unmistakably him. He was standing in the doorway like he'd been waiting for me his entire life, and I realized with a shock that maybe he had been. "Hi, kid," he said softly. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I was frozen somewhere between a million emotions. "I know you're angry," he said. "I know this seems insane, but I need you to hear me out. Can you come inside?" I followed him through the door like I was in a dream. The inside of the house was sparse but clean. A kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, photographs on the walls. And in every single photograph I could see myself. Me as a child, me at my graduation, me last year at my birthday party. He'd been taking pictures of me, watching me. For 2 years, while I'd been mourning him, he'd been watching my life unfold. "You've been following me," I said. "Yes," he admitted. He sat down on the couch and gestured for me to sit next to him. "I've been watching you, making sure you were okay, making sure you were safe." "Safe from what?" I demanded. "What could possibly justify 2 years of fake death and surveillance?" He took a long breath. "Do you remember when you were 12? When your friend Sarah's father disappeared?" I did remember. It was the first time I'd ever seen someone's life destroyed by something inexplicable. "The police never found him," my father continued. "He just vanished. And they never told anyone, but the FBI was involved. They suspected it was because of something he'd done a long time ago, something he'd seen. He'd been in witness protection, and someone had found him." I felt something cold move through my chest. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," my father interrupted gently, "that I spent 30 years working for the federal government in a capacity I can't discuss. I saw things, terrible things, and I made enemies, dangerous people. When I was 45 years old, I realized that those people had learned about your mother, and you and your sister. They were interested in you. They were planning to use you as leverage." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin. "So I did what they asked me to do," he said. "I contacted someone inside the agency, and we put together a plan. I staged my death. I went underground, and I've spent the last 2 years making sure that you were never followed, that no one ever got close to you, that you could live your life without looking over your shoulder." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. My voice was shaking. "Because the less you knew, the safer you were," he said. "If you didn't know I was alive, then you couldn't accidentally give me away. You couldn't tell someone something that would put you in danger." I stood up and walked to the window. I could see the lighthouse from there, standing on the rocky shore like a sentinel. "So everything was a lie? Your death, our entire grief?" "No," he said firmly. "My love for you was never a lie. My desire to keep you safe was never a lie. The only lie was the death. Everything else was true." I turned to face him. "And now? Is the danger gone?" He shook his head. "Not entirely, but it's diminished. The man who was looking for me died last year. Complications from cardiac issues, according to the news. And there's a new administration in the agency. They've assured me that the threat level has decreased significantly." "So you're coming back," I said. It wasn't a question. "I wanted to," he replied, "but I needed to make sure it was safe first. I needed to make sure you'd want me to." I looked at my father, really looked at him for the first time since I'd arrived. He was older and gray and worn down by whatever he'd been carrying. He was also the man who'd taught me how to ride a bike, the man who'd held me through my first heartbreak, the man who'd organized surprise birthday parties and sung off-key at my graduation, and believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He was my father, and he'd sacrificed everything to keep me safe. "I'm still angry," I said, "about the funeral, about missing you, about all of it." "I know," he said, "and you have the right to be angry. But I also understand," I continued. "I don't like it, I don't forgive it yet, but I understand." We talked for hours. He told me things I'd never known about his past, about the agency work, about the threats he'd received, about the night he'd decided to disappear. He cried, and I cried, and somewhere in that shared grief and understanding, something shifted. He asked me about my life, about my job and my friends and the man I'd been seeing for 6 months and the dreams I had for the future. He listened like someone who had been starving for connection, and I realized that he had been. He'd been watching me but not touching my life. He'd been present but absent. It was its own kind of torture. Before I left, he gave me something, a journal. "I've been writing to you since the day I staged my death," he said. "Every day I've been writing about my thoughts, my regrets, my memories of you. I want you to have it, so you know that even though I was gone, I was still here, in my mind, in my heart. Every single day." I took the journal. It was thick, filled with hundreds of pages of his handwriting. On the first page, he'd written, "To my daughter, the only thing worth giving up everything for." I drove back to the city in a state of profound disorientation. The world looked the same. The trees were still green. The roads were still gray. But everything had changed. My grief had transformed into something more complicated. Understanding mixed with anger, mixed with forgiveness, mixed with love. Over the next year, my father and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. He moved to a small apartment in my city. We had dinner together every Sunday. We talked about his fears and his regrets. We talked about what it meant to trust each other again. My mom and sister struggled more than I did. They felt betrayed in a way I was beginning to understand wasn't about my father's deception, but about their inability to protect me. My father eventually told them everything, and the conversations were harder than anything I experienced. But slowly, tentatively, they also began to forgive. What I learned from all of this is that the people we love don't always make the choices we would make. They don't always choose transparency or connection. Sometimes they choose sacrifice, even when it costs them everything. Sometimes they choose danger to keep us safe. And sometimes we have to accept that their choices, even the ones that hurt us, came from a place of love so profound that we can't comprehend it, until we stop looking for logic and start looking for the heart beneath the decision. My father didn't return to the lighthouse. He didn't go back underground. He chose to live his remaining years in connection with the people he loved, even though it meant living with the constant fear that the past might catch up with him. And I realized that was the bravest thing he could have done. The postcard still sits in a frame on my desk. Sometimes I look at it, and I remember that morning when I thought my world had been upended. And I realized that it had been, just not in the way I feared. It had been upended in a way that allowed me to understand that love, real love, is sometimes about sacrifice. It's about making the impossible choices. It's about watching someone you love from a distance because that's the only way to keep them safe. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to close the distance, to come home, to be a family again. Not because everything is resolved, not because everything makes sense, but because we choose to try. And that choice, that willingness to forgive and to reconnect, is more powerful than any secret could ever be.